In recent years, the UFC has grown to become a multi-million-dollar monster of an industry, attracting viewers, sponsorships, and investments. The new generation of viewers are drawn to the spectacle and the substantial amounts fighters make. But beneath the glamour and limelight lies the harsh truth that many UFC fighters are really broke and struggling financially, each for various reasons. From retired fighters like Mark Coleman, who is currently struggling with life after the UFC, to fighters like War Machine, who have been put behind bars for breaking the law, and others like Diego Sanchez, who blew their winnings away. Here are UFC fighters that are broke. We're kicking off with the Killer Gorilla, Jared Cannonier. Since his professional MMA debut in 2011, the 40-year-old American UFC middleweight, nicknamed the Killer Gorilla, has been a force to be reckoned with in the UFC, featuring in 25 matches and winning 17 of those fights in dramatic fashion. His striking hooks, great vibe, uppercuts, energy, clinch work, and knockout power won the applause of the audience and fans. It is expected that his winnings, standout performances, and various other accomplishments, for example, the AFC Heavyweight Championship, have brought him money and fame. But before the money and the fame, his journey to the UFC was full of obstacles. He signed with the UFC in 2014 and suffered a string of early losses that brought him modest earnings. In 2016, after an 18-month layoff through injuries, he fought and defeated Cyril Asker, earning himself a huge payout in a Performance of the Night bonus. Similarly, he earned much more from his winnings in the fights with Ion Cutelaba and David Branch, respectively. And although he suffered from a torn pectoral muscle, he seemed to be doing just fine when he returned. Notable victories against top contenders like Anderson Silva was a big boost. For example, he received a whopping $400,000 in bonuses for beating Sean Strickland, while his fights with Kevin Gastelum and Derek Brunson earned him $191,000 and $261,000, respectively. After the fight with Kevin Gastelum, fans expected that a career in the limelight and his recent injuries would make him consider taking a break to shore up his spirits before the title shot against Israel Adesanya. So fans were shocked to hear that the elite contender would be back in action sooner than presumed. The Killer Gorilla revealed in a post-fight interview with Daniel Cormier that he couldn't afford to take a break as he had money problems and would have to fight to stay afloat. Many who have always talked about the UFC's remuneration policy pointed out that the situation with the third best middleweight in the world was proof that the UFC's remuneration policy was deeply flawed. Due to a notable lack of sponsorship deals with big businesses and bad luck attracting interest from the entertainment sector, his finances have plummeted. He has been unable to earn money outside of the industry, and injuries have been a constant problem. Like that wasn't enough. During his time on the sidelines, he lost a significant amount of money to taxes, credit cards, and gyms. His current net worth is around $1 million. Continuing this thread of UFC players who are broke is the story of another towering presence in the UFC, Mike Perry, and he is currently out of sorts. Mike Perry. Without question, Michael Joseph Perry is famous for his many controversies, most of which have made him an odd presence in the UCF. Nowadays, the UFC welterweight competes in the middleweight division of the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, BKFC, and currently ranks as number 4. But when it comes to money problems in the UFC, Perry is not a new face. Quite remarkably, he started off competing for regional promotions, winning various fights across the US. His unique style and persona earned him the nickname Platinum. With an astonishing 22 fights and 14 wins under his belt, Perry cemented his status as a formidable presence in the UFC. Soon, his status, high-profile fights, and explorations fetched him financial rewards, including Performance of the Night bonuses against Alex Reyes and Alex Oliveira. However, his money problems persist. Perry has been punished for violating the UFC's policies. In 2020, after weighing in at 175.5 pounds, he received a 30% pay cut. With good reasons, fans attribute Perry's money problems to personal failures. Throughout his career, he has been haunted by legal problems. In a bid to justify this, the UFC fighter revealed that growing up in Michigan and Florida, where he was often the victim of bullying, was the reason for his erratic behavior. Yet his social media accounts offer the fans a glimpse into the financial realities of UFC fighters' lives. His 2019 post about his remuneration is one example. He had to reveal to over 400,000 fans that he owed back taxes and had barely any money in his bank account. Things got so bad he had to cut corners to earn more money and offered fans the chance to join his corner for a price. According to sources, his current worth is approximately around $1 million. Mark Coleman's current post-retirement struggles also add some truth to the story that the UFC has failed to do enough for its legends. Mark Coleman. Generally speaking, Coleman, the much-respected retired mixed martial artist and professional wrestler, remains a legend among fans of the UFC. With 16 out of 26 fights, he made his mark in the world of wrestling, becoming the World Championship runner-up and the Pan American Games gold medalist. More than anything, the godfather of ground and punch proved to viewers and fans that a wrestler could dominate in the world of the UFC. Coleman, unlike most other fighters, started strong, winning his first 2 tournaments until a devastating ACL injury against Morris Smith sidelined him for nearly 2 years. Through spells in the Japanese Pride Fighting Championships and a couple of small investments like his team, Hammer House, Coleman supplemented his income at the time. His promotional presence in the UFC has, over the years, brought a lot of publicity and revenue for the sport. Numerous accomplishments and financial rewards support this claim, including the UFC 10 and UFC 11 Tournament Champion Award, the first UFC Heavyweight Champion Award, and the Pride Fighting Championships of 2000. He is also the Openweight Grand Prix champion and winner of the UFC Viewer's Choice Award. Fans were happy to see him inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, but after his loss to his fellow Hall of Famer Randy Couture, he was unable to secure any more promotions. Recently, it was reported that he was in need of funds following surgery complications. His close associate, Wes Sims, even set up a GoFundMe to help alleviate Coleman's circumstances. In response to questions regarding why the UFC legend and seemingly successful retiree had no money in his checking account, Sims explained that Coleman made unwise investment decisions. There are also rumors that his drinking problems may have something to do with his current circumstances, but unlike Coleman, some other fighters moved with the wrong crowd and lost their fortune to strippers, Ponzi schemes, drinks, and lavish parties. Diego Sanchez is a striking example. Diego Sanchez, nicknamed The Nightmare, is now a 42-year-old fighter fighting in the super lightweight division of Eagle Fighting Championship. He has, by most standards, had a glamorous career that includes 30 wins in 42 fights. The Mexican-American was introduced to the world of professional fights when he won a UFC contract by defeating Kemi Florian. Winning awards, including the middleweight tournament of the UFC after a long 11-0 undefeated streak, made him a fearsome fighter. He did lose this record when he came up against Josh Koscheck at UFC 69. However, fans have been unable to forget that few fighters in MMA have been associated with more Fight of the Year bouts than Sanchez, and very few have competed against 4 different weight classes consistently for years. During his career, he was involved in highly publicized fights with fighters like Karo Parisayan, Clay Guida, and BJ Penn. For many who would doubt the financial benefits of his fighting career, it is not possible to ignore the fact that he won numerous Fight of the Night bonuses against Joe Stevenson, Clay Guida, Paulo Thiago, Jake Ellenberger, and Gilbert Melendez. According to his own admission, his financial problems are the result of his own carelessness and gullibility. In an interview with Bleacher Report, Sanchez revealed that he was fooled by a lifestyle of sex, parties, and bad friends. He lost money to Ponzi schemes and leeches, and his net worth currently sits at around $2 million, which is really disappointing for someone who used to practically run things in the UFC, but at least Sanchez was loved. How about Woodley, who went broke and still had to deal with hate from fans? Tyron Woodley. Up to the moment when he conceded his title to Kamaru Usman at UFC 235, Tyron Woodley reigned as UFC welterweight division champion for 3 years. After each victory, his status as a television personality with a social conscience and his confidence as a fighter seemed to grow. With confidence, he acquired status and power. Soon, Woodley became one of the faces of the UFC. However, the well-educated graduate of the University of Missouri soon became one of the most hated fighters in the UFC. The funny thing is that Woodley first gained the admiration of fans before sparking controversy, but later on, many found him smug and self-aggrandizing, pointing out his insistence on picking fights and calling the shots. The fact is, not every UFC champion is a fan favorite. Most fans of the UFC don't really like Michael Bisping. Fans also find Demetrius Johnson, Conor McGregor, and John Jones caustic and divisive. With Woodley, the argument always points to his journey in the UFC, and his biggest haters have suggested that his journey to the championship was quite disingenuous. Woodley earned his stripes by coming up against some of the most loved fighters in MMA and winning controversially. Critics were quick to point out that he defeated Carlos Condit only after Condit busted his knee, and then he was in a title fight only because Gastelum missed weight and was sidelined for 18 months. The knockout against the much-respected Robbie Lawler seemed to be the last straw, and it just got people against him the more. It also didn't help that, in a bid to earn more money from fights, he openly disrespected Stephen Wonderboy and started to pick fights fights against fighters like Conor McGregor, Nick Diaz, and Georges St-Pierre. The incident with Thompson, when he constantly insulted him, was another notorious example. It turns out Woodley has been terrible at keeping whatever money he could make. According to his own admission, he lost a large amount of his money due to his lack of financial education. He admits that his poor background did not prepare him enough for life as a UFC fighter and the material wealth that came with earning money and constantly being in the spotlight. However, since his fight with Jake Paul, he has been slowly finding his feet. He is currently worth around $4 million. Let's move on to the story of another UFC fighter who, like many of the others, prepared quite badly for his retirement. Donald Cerrone. Recently, Dana White and other UFC legends expressed their disappointment in Cerrone's decision to come out of retirement after using performance-boosting steroids to deal with the effects of injuries sustained throughout his career. Ever since his small beginnings in the WEC, Cerrone has become widely recognized as one of the most important fighters in the past decades. Many legends have joined in the conversations around his decision, most of which converge upon the question of ethics in the world of UFC and the question of legacy. Rightly or wrongly, his decision has drawn criticism and attacks from fellow UFC legends like Daniel Cormier. For Cormier, the decision is unethical and unpopular, and it began with bad examples set by fighters like Conor McGregor. With 48 fights to his name, Cormier argued, Cerrone had little financial motivation for seeking another fight and a legacy to protect. Unbothered by the tide of negative perceptions, Cerrone set his sights on his return. Beyond his quest for an unprecedented 50 career fights, financial realities drove his decision. Speculators have suggested that the fighter has been in a dump as a result of bad investments and a lack of savings. Retirement has proven to be a bitter pill to swallow. Needless to say, the cowboy is broke and needs the money. It's one thing to let bad investments wreck your finances, but what about fighters like Velasquez, who went broke for defending his child? Cain Velasquez. Fans of the UFC were surprised to hear that Cain Velasquez could be going to prison for up to 40 years if found guilty in court. The retired UFC fighter appeared in the Santa Clara County Court on gun charges and attempted murder. After pleading no contest, it is expected that Velasquez may get a light sentence from Judge Arthur Bocanegra. Prior to his trial, the fighter was arrested in March 2022 for driving beyond the speed limit and shooting at a car carrying Harry Goulart, a man believed to have molested Velasquez's 4-year-old son. Goulart was unharmed, but his stepfather was wounded. After his arrest, initial reports suggested that the former UFC fighter might be going away for up to 2 decades. As of October 2024, the sentencing was scheduled to be held on January 24, 2025. Cain Velasquez's illustrious UCF career, marked by fame, money, and swift, steady, smart punching combinations, as well as his resilience and endurance, is now eclipsed by this possibility of incarceration. The former heavyweight champion's most notable victory was against Brock Lesnar in the UFC Heavyweight Championship. He is still a role model to fans and other young people looking to be UFC fighters. However, as a result of his legal troubles and a range of other personal problems, he has suffered financial setbacks that have affected his fortune. He is now worth around $4 million. Talking about more fighters whose finances took a huge hit due to family tragedies. Walt Harris. Since 2011, Harris has become a noticeable figure in the UFC. He's also generally considered one of the really good guys in the UFC. The American mixed martial artist has fought in the heavyweight division of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and in 2019, after being constantly ranked the 9th best fighter in the UFC, he was expected to go for the heavyweight championship, but tragedy struck. In October 2019, his cherished stepdaughter, Anaya Blanchard, a student in Auburn, Alabama, was killed by a gunshot wound. A 29-year-old man known as Ibrahim Yazid was apprehended and charged with capital murder. He was so devastated that he took a 6-month break from fighting, but after his break, he returned to fight the UFC heavy hitter Alistair Overeem. Following his loss, he admitted in his post-fight interview that he had rushed his return. He said he returned to fighting quickly because of the emotional pain from his stepdaughter's death and his difficulty handling the grief and helplessness. Upon his return, he was suspended for a while after the Nevada Athletic Commission, NAC, found that his blood contained drostanolone, an illegal substance. As a result of this ruling, Harris is considered unfit to fight until 2027. In an interview with The Post, he suggested that he was abusing substances on a daily basis and generally not looking after himself, mentally and physically. With the help of friends and his therapist, he finally decided to take time off and, for 25 months, only followed the sports from a distance and looked after himself. But again, in January, he announced his return via social media and started training in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was again suspended, this time for violating anti-doping laws. Since this 2024 suspension, Harris has been without a constant source of income. Like Harris, various other fighters have been suspended for not following the UFC's policies, and Hussein Askabov is another fighter facing a similar fate. Hussein Askabov. Askabov is a Russian fighter famous for his serial wins and his unique fighting style. Since 2012, he has been competing in the featherweight division with affiliations to Tiger Muay Thai and American Top Team. He has had a highly impressive MMA record of 23 wins and just 1 loss. About 30% of his wins came through decisions, 43% came through submissions, and 26% through technical knockouts. Although he has fought in the UFC just once, the featherweight champion has become one of the many fighters suspended for breaking the anti-doping laws. Until his loss to Jamal Emmers in February 2023, he had become one of the most promising fighters in the UFC. The MMA statistics showed that he was regularly featured in a list of the most well-rounded and well-regarded fighters in the business, with ties to WWFC and GEFC. Testing positive for methandienone was just another chance to speak against the Russian who had come under the spotlight lately for all the wrong reasons.
2 Russian MMA fighter twin brothers apparently bound and tortured an Italian man in order to extort money. So, renowned MMA fighters Hussein Askabov and his identical twin brother Hassan have been detained in connection to a violent home invasion in Chungtalai Resort in Phuket, where an Italian resident was robbed of personal items exceeding 12 million baht.
One after the other, 3 fights had fallen through, for reasons ranging from armed robbery allegations to misdemeanors. Fans were surprised to hear that his fight against Daniel Pineda at UFC Vegas 80 was put off because the Russian had been under investigation for a case of armed robbery, kidnapping, and torture in Phuket, Thailand. He and his brother were released rather unceremoniously after the charges were dropped. Ultimately, the doping results have left the fighter isolated and unable to compete again until 2026. That's 3 years hanging on the sidelines. Also, his suspension means he will not be looking forward to getting paid anytime soon. And if we're talking about sidelined players, another player we need to talk about is Nam Phan. Nam Phan. Following his big break in his debut against Jason Maxwell in 2001, Nam Phan had a long spell in the UFC, WEC, and Strikeforce. He was impressive, astonishing, and ruthless. Until his defeat against Rob McCullough in 2003, he won fight after fight in the most spectacular way. A single impressive moment was his debut in the Ultimate Fighting Championship when he took down Mike Budnick. In 2015, he won the title of the King of Pancrase in the featherweight division. This led to other impressive winnings with financial rewards like 2 Fight of the Night bonuses against Leonard Garcia. But then, after a series of losses and a general decline in his performance, Phan ended his UFC career. Since retiring from fighting, Phan has devoted his time to running the Madu Academy, teaching eager learners the basics of Brazilian boxing, Muay Thai, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There are doubts his business ventures have been successful, as fans were shocked to notice a severe deterioration in his speech. There are suggestions that this is a result of acute and fatal brain disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Our next fighter is popularly considered one of the greatest fighters ever. If your guess is Jon Jones, then you guessed right. Jon Jones. Jones, a ruthless competitor most fans of the UFC consider the greatest fighter ever, still competes in the UFC heavyweight division. He still stands as the UFC heavyweight champion, a title he held from 2011 to 2015 and from 2018 to 2020. Fame and money have been associated with Jon Jones since his beginnings in 2008, even before he became the youngest champion in the history of the UFC at the tender age of 23 by beating Mauricio Rua. Besides his towering presence and devastating bouts, Jones has, quite predictably, been associated with records. Early on, he was considered the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Additionally, he held the record for the most wins, the most defenses, and certainly the longest winning streak. His only loss was the controversial fight against Matt Hamill. Few fans have been able to forget cherished moments like when he defeated IFL light heavyweight Vladimir Matyushenko through a brutal TKO, making Dana White proclaim that he would become one of the greatest earners in the history of the UFC. He would go on to equal Chuck Liddell's number of successful title defenses and match Tito Ortiz's record for the most consecutive title defenses in history. However, on the other side of his glittering career are the controversies he's been involved in, some of which made him lose his title 3 different times. These issues ranged from the trivial to the most shocking, such as the hit-and-run charges in 2015 that led to his removal from UFC rankings. He would return in dramatic fashion to win his fights against Ovince St. Preux and Daniel Cormier, but these fights were ruled out bout when Jones tested positive for banned substances. As expected, he received further suspensions, including spending about 3 years away from the MMA. Additionally, he was stripped of his title twice for various offenses, and after testing positive for turinabol, he was suspended again. Ultimately, Jones's finances have been upset by these controversies and legal troubles. The various convictions, numerous altercations, domestic violence arrests, and failed drug tests continue to count in the huge bag of his losses. Despite his great promise and status, he is currently worth just $3 million. And how about two brothers who were once individually great fighters at the UFC, but for some reason have decided to end their career the same way? If you still don't know who they are, you must have not heard of the Diaz brothers. Nate Diaz. Together with his brother Nick Diaz, Nate Diaz is one of the UFC's most controversial fighters. After his brother talked him into becoming a fighter, he trained, signed up, and soon became a fan favorite through his tough boy attitude and jiu-jitsu skills. After his fight against Gamburian early in his career, he signed a 6-figure contract with the UFC. Nowadays, he's mostly famous as the guy who twice beat the UFC loudmouth Conor McGregor. It's important to remember he holds several important records, including the record for the 3rd most UFC bonus awards, most of which he won against the toughest fighters in the UFC and MMA for the past 2 decades. Fans believe fighters like Nate Diaz make money through their fights. Evidently, he has scraped millions of dollars through his fights, his UFC salary, his endorsements, and his businesses. Ironically, Diaz made the most money not from his UFC career, but from coming up against YouTuber-turned-boxer Jake Paul and McGregor. His fight against McGregor earned him about $13 million. Fans of the UFC were shocked to learn that he earned about $2 million simply by showing up. With each earning from his various ventures outside the MMA and UFC, fans continued to re-examine the UFC's remuneration policy. Diaz made millions of dollars he had never dreamed of since his UFC debut, when he made a few $1,000s. Some of his other biggest paydays include his $250,000 deal with Reebok and his cut of the PPV revenue that fetched him as high as $10.5 million. His cannabis production company, Game Up Nutrition, and his deal with Lodi Vintners have also made him a sizable fortune. His home in Stockton is worth at least $500,000, and Forbes magazine put his net worth around $15 million. For a fighter who ranks highly among fighters who have received the most fight night bonuses and submission wins, fans were shocked to learn that he has been having trouble with the IRS. As of July 2024, he hinted that he was going to declare bankruptcy. Remember his brother that we talked about earlier? Well, it seems money problems run in the family, because the next player we're talking about is his brother, Nick Diaz. Like his brother Nate, Nick has made for himself a name in the UFC and MMA. He was banned for using marijuana indiscriminately. Like his brother, he has faced disciplinary actions for various reasons, adding to his ban. Sometime in his career, he was sidelined for almost 6 years. Lately, there have been reports and concerns among fans and the public that the fighter is going through a range of personal problems. Although the 41-year-old fighter is on the verge of making a UFC return in a fight against Vicente Luque in Las Vegas, the story, gaining ground, is that the fighter is mentally and physically unfit. His fight against Robbie Lawler at UFC 266 ended in a dismal TKO that left even Lawler concerned for the Stockton native. His ex-girlfriend Kay recently posted a video on X that gave fans a lot to talk about. The video showed a shirtless, crouching man resembling the welterweight champion, looking fatigued and emaciated, following up on her Instagram post, which tagged the fighter in a message about drug addiction. This is another installment in a series of messages that have kept up the buzz about the luck and well-being of the fighter. Concerned about his readiness for the fight, Daniel Cormier said he'd prefer Nick postpone the match if he's not fully prepared, since UFC 310 is one of the most anticipated fights of the year. Like his brother, Nick has had an illustrious career and has had a positive influence in MMA. A huge pointer to the fighter's recent money troubles was the fact that the fighter had set up an OnlyFans account on the day he was scheduled to fight Vicente Luque. He is also reportedly on the bad side of the IRS. Fans were hopeful that Diaz's last fight against Robbie Lawler would be his last, due to his awful performance. However, the veteran refused to officially call it a day. Well, Nick Diaz had the choice to continue fighting or not, but how about the War Machine, who was forced to end his career because he's been convicted and serving his sentence? War Machine. In 2017, the UFC fanbase was far from happy by news reporting that UFC fighter John Paul Koppenhaver, also known as the War Machine, was convicted of 29 counts by a Las Vegas jury for kidnapping, raping, and assaulting his ex-girlfriend Christy Mack and assaulting her boyfriend Corey Thomas. The UFC fighter has had an amazing career that includes 14 wins out of 19 total fights. The War Machine had the 3 lesser counts thrown out of court, but the tight-lipped jury of 6 men and 6 women who were pleased with the verdict remained convinced that the former UFC fighter got what he deserved. The War Machine made his UFC debut in 2007, and until his incarceration, he maintained an impressive 14-5 record as a fighter in the welterweight division until his last fight in 2013. He was sentenced to 36 years to life and will not be eligible for parole until he is technically 71 years old. During his trial, the fighter spoke bitterly and penitently about his terrible past and bad habits. He remarked that he has been planning on ending it all like his friend, the former NFL player Aaron Hernandez, who did the same while incarcerated in Massachusetts. It was such a shame to hear that he was convicted, and with that conviction, it was clear that the War Machine would be out of cash for a long time. If you enjoyed this video and want more interesting stories like this, check out one of these boxes on your screen.